This is a brief presentation on the woodpeckers of the Mendocino Coast, presented by the Mendocino Coast Audubon Society. It's intended to just get you familiar with the species that can be found here. As you can see on the opening slide, we have at least 7 species of woodpeckers that are found here at least sometimes. 6 of these are relatively common year-round, and one of them is a very rare wintertime visitor. We'll start with one of the more abundant woodpeckers, very common species. This is the Downy Woodpecker. First thing to notice is that this is a little black and white bird with a white patch down the center of its back and a black and white striped face. There are 2 species that meet that description though, so we'll talk a little bit about how to tell them apart. This is the smaller of the 2. Downy woodpeckers are chiefly recognizable by the small, very sharply pointed bill. As David Jensen says, Downies are delicate. They have a little delicate looking bill. Doesn't really look like a woodpecker bill. It looks more like a warbler bill, really. The other thing you can look for is the pattern on the underside of the tail feathers. Sometimes you can't see their bills clearly, so we'll get into that in a little bit. Just want to point out on the birds on the left and right, you can see a little red patch at the nape, indicating that those are male birds. And on juvenile birds, sometimes there will be a little red patch on the forehead as well. This is the hairy woodpecker, and right away you can see it looks a lot like a downy woodpecker. It's black and white. It has a white patch down the center of its back, and it has a black and white striped face with a little red nape on the males. That bird on the right, you can see what I was talking about, a little pinkish patch on the forehead. That's a juvenile hairy. The big difference is the bills. Notice that these have big, massive looking bills, very heavy duty. More like what you'd expect for a woodpecker, really. And typically, the bill length on a hairy woodpecker is about the same as the length of its head. In other words, if you measured an imaginary line from the base of its bill back to the back of its head, that's about the same distance as from the base of its bill out to the tip. Now that bird on the lower left, though, kind of gives you an idea of how tricky this can be in the field. If you imagine that bird moving around, it's going to be kind of hard to tell just which species this really is. So let's talk about the comparison. Okay, here's both species side by side, and wouldn't it be nice if they did that in the field so that we could just compare them right next to each other. But you can see right off the bat when they are side by side that the downy has a little tiny bill compared to the hairy. The other thing you can notice in this slide that actually really helps is where they're found. So the hairy woodpecker on the left is up against the trunk of a tree, and probably 90% of the time or more, that's where you're going to see them. They very rarely go out on branches, and when they do, it's usually a pretty large branch. The downy woodpecker on the right is out there in the twigs, and that's not uncommon for them. They will move around. They'll go up the trunk of a tree just fine, but they will also go out on the branches a lot, sometimes almost like a nuthatch, and they will go way out into the twigs. They love to poke around in things like willows. They're very common in riparian and brushy habitat. I've even found them out in a brushy meadow, hopping around in bushes. And a couple of times I have seen them climbing around in particularly robust weeds. So they will make use of much smaller habitat than a hairy woodpecker, which is pretty much restricted to trees. And the downies like trees just fine, but they will be found out in smaller habitat as well. And when you see a little black and white woodpecker out in the twigs like that, you can be pretty sure it's a downy. Vocalizations are not particularly distinctive. They are, but it takes a little practice to really get to where you can recognize one just by its calls. Here is the hairy woodpecker. A really forceful squeak. That sound really carries through the woods, and it kind of alerts you to the presence of these birds. To me, it kind of sounds like somebody jumping on a squeaky toy. Here's, for comparison, here is the Downy Woodpecker. It's a little shorter sound and more of a pick than a squeak. Like I said, they're kind of similar, but they are a little bit different. With practice, you can tell them apart. Here's the whinny call of the Downy Woodpecker, just for comparison. Well, there you go. You hear those things, you can at least look around, try to find the birds. Let's check some other ways to tell these guys apart. Here's a really great little clue that Roger Adamson kind of tipped me off to. Notice there on the lower right, that looking up the backside shot, you can't see the head at all, and you might not really know what you're looking at here, but that is a woodpecker, and you can tell it's a Downy Woodpecker because they are the ones with those bars or spots on the underside of the tail. And those spots and bars extend all the way to the upper side of those feathers. Those are just the undertail feathers. They have black feathers covering them. But look at that bird in the center. In fact, look at both of those birds in there. You can kind of tell that their heads are turned at an angle, so it's pretty hard to tell just how big the bill is, even relatively. You can't really, from this picture, I don't think I could tell these two birds apart just by the bill length. But they're different species, and you can tell that by looking at the other end of the bird. Down there on the tail feathers, on that bird in the middle, you can see just kind of peeking out some of those barred undertail feathers, whereas on the bird on the left, you can see right underneath his tail, and it's all clear white. So the bird on the left is a hairy woodpecker, and the bird in the center is a Downy Woodpecker, and they're the ones with those spots. That's actually surprisingly useful field mark. When they're moving around in the trees, you actually often get to see underneath their tails. So just remember that when you're trying to figure them out. Well, this is a little easier bird. This is probably recognizable to everyone. This is the iconic bird of the California oak woodlands, the Acorn Woodpecker. Common yard visitor. You can see that one on the lower left is at a suet feeder. They come into your yard and pretty much run everybody else off. Even the jays will stand back and let these guys feed. They're immediately recognizable by their calls. That's the one I call the Gadaka call, and then here's the Yaka Yaka. Just visually, you can see they have no white in the center of their back. When they're perched like this, they're all black on the back. When they fly, they display these brilliant white wing patches. Very distinctive look in flight. Here is another common and well-known bird found in yards and fields and pretty much everywhere. This is the northern flicker. And you see these guys on the ground a lot. They feed quite often, especially in winter, along the ground. And that's because they are also major league anteaters. That is the major part of their diet. I've read that over 90% of their diet is ants. So they hop around on the ground, probing into ant hills, and they have enormously long tongues that they run down into the ant tunnels and fish the little guys out. You can see that bird of the left has dirt all over his bill. He's been probing around in the dirt for ants. There are two kinds of northern flickers, the red-shafted and yellow-shafted. We only have northern red-shafted flickers here. The red-shafted flicker has a red malar. That's that strawberry red stripe on its face right behind the bill. On a yellow-shafted flicker, that little patch is black. The red-shafted flicker, when he flies, displays salmon pink or orange wing linings and under tail feathers. Really distinctive. They're beautiful birds. And here's what they sound like. You hear this call a lot. And then when they're singing, which is mostly in the spring, but they actually kind of do this almost anytime they feel like it, this is what they sound like. This is the call that gave them their name. Flicka, 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 flicka. That's why they're called flickers. As you can see, they breed here in, like all the woodpeckers we have here, they dig out nests in standing dead trees. And here, finally, is the largest woodpecker we have, and in fact, the largest North American woodpecker, since the ivory bill is apparently extinct. This is a pileated, or also pronounced pileated woodpecker. And you can see that big bright red crest and striking black and white face pattern, and the enormous size. These birds are about the size of a crow, and they fly like woodpeckers. Like all the other woodpeckers, they have that dipsy-doodle flight. They flap a couple of times and then fold their wings right up against their body and just soar like somebody throwing a rock. So when they fly, they go up and down a lot. And when you see one the size of a crow doing that, it's pretty hard to mistake it for anything else. Particularly since they often vocalize while they fly, and they sound like this. Almost a manic kind of sound. Really distinctive and really loud. You can hear them from a long ways off, and when you hear that sound, look around. Often you can catch a glimpse of them as they fly through the trees. Well, we're going to finish up with the two sapsuckers that we have here on the coast. Actually, one of them is a fairly common resident bird, and the other one is an occasional rare visitor. The one on the left is the red-breasted sapsucker that is a year-round resident, fairly common bird and widely seen in orchards and anywhere where there are deciduous trees. You can see those little holes, the horizontal rows of holes they drill into the bark. They go through the bark into the cambium, and that lets the sap well out. Those are actually called sap wells. And then they lap up the sap. And they also get insects that are drawn to that sap as well. So they get both carbohydrates and sugar and protein out of it. The red-breasted sapsucker has a red head and throat, and I guess the red goes a little ways down on the breast, but mostly it's kind of yellowish below that. They also have 2 lines of mottled white feathers going down the back, so they don't have that white patch like Downies and Harrys do, but they're not all black like acorns either. They do have fairly distinctive vocalizations. They're pretty similar. This is the red-breasted sapsucker. And here for comparison is a yellow-bellied sapsucker. Pretty similar, just maybe a little more drawn out on the yellow-bellied, but I'm not sure you can really reliably tell them apart by calls alone. What the calls do is tell you that there's a sapsucker around, and often you have to be really patient and wait these birds out because they just love to run around to the other side of the tree and hide behind the trunk from you. And sometimes you have to wait quite a while. They're quite shy birds, but eventually they'll come around where you can see them and tell which one you've got. Now the yellow-bellied sapsucker there on the right is actually an eastern bird, and the west coast is not part of their normal range, but there are a number of them that range out this far, especially in wintertime. And we get one or two in winter on the Mendocino Coast, and the main place that they tend to be found is at the Rose Memorial Cemetery in Fort Bragg, working on the Banksia trees there. So that's the place to look for them, but you know, with one or two birds on the whole coast, they're a pretty rare phenomenon. Well, I hope you've enjoyed that introduction to woodpeckers on the Mendocino Coast and learned a thing or two and can now reliably tell apart all those species in the field. I'll see you out there. Happy birding.